webinar series hosted by the Borders and Governance Lab at the University of Victoria. In an era where border complexities continue to evolve, the integration of cutting-edge research with practical policy applications becomes increasingly vital. The Borders and Governance Lab continues to serve as a crucial bridge between academic insight and real-world implementation, fostering dialogue among researchers, practitioners, and policymakers across continents. As we move along, please use the Q&A to enter any questions you have as we move along through the session. So let's get going. I'm honored to introduce and welcome Ben Rohrbaugh. Ben is a distinguished voice at the intersection of border security, trade policy, and humanitarian response. Ben brings a remarkable blend of high-level government experience and an entrepreneurial vision to our discussion. As a former director for enforcement and border security at the National Security Council during the Obama administration and a senior advisor at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, Ben helped to frame national policies that balance security imperatives with economic vitality. He now applies his wealth of experience as CEO of Lantern UAS, developing cutting-edge technological solutions for border management, and as a partner at Clearway Solutions, where he focuses on humanitarian response initiatives ranging from disaster recovery to migrant services. Ben's unique trajectory from policy corridors in Washington to technological innovation and humanitarian work provides a fascinating lens through which to examine contemporary border and governance challenges. Ben, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So Ben, I want to start off, and it kind of goes back to this concept that you've had a remarkable career, and that career path has taken you from National Security Council to founding Lantern UAS and a partnership role in Clearway Solutions. Could you share some of the pivotal moments that shaped your understanding of border security?
Absolutely. So the key points sort of for me in better understanding how border security worked and how to try to integrate policy, operational, and technological solutions were all based in my experience in government. When I first started working on borders and border management, actually seeing the way that physical processes on the borders worked was an incredible eye-opener for me. Going and seeing trucks filled with crates of cilantro with ice on top of them in the sun in the summer in South Texas and other things, and seeing the way they were physically inspected really helped me understand where the processes were, where technology had advanced and where things were being done in a really exciting and new way, and where things had been, were being done the way that they've been done for decades. I particularly enjoyed and learned a lot from working with other North American partners. So I was privileged when I was at Customs and Border Protection and at the White House to work with counterparts across the Canadian and Mexican governments. And that really helped me understand how much border security can't just be about intercepting things in a physical line, what one chance to identify something that's potentially dangerous and using a bunch of resources to stop things there, but really has to be integrated with partners on both sides of the border and has to involve larger processes. And then finally, I've been I think that's really helped my perspective and really helped me grow and better understand the border security enterprise has been dealing with things from the private sector side and understanding partnership processes with government and contracting. When I was in government, I was a political appointee, and so you stay away from contracts because that's how you get in trouble. And so being on the other side of things, once I've been in the private sector for longer and been able to see this, I've really come to understand and appreciate how much of the actual processes that government does are done by contractors, and how important it is that those are done well and by people who have a sophisticated understanding of border security and the government's mission.
Wow, and that's really interesting context because it is like the sausage making of border control, and it's transactional, it's alive, and it's vibrant. It's not sort of sterile like policy directions can be in that realm. So when you examine successful border governance and operations and technological innovations. What common elements have you observed, and how might these inform a more adaptive and strategic approach to sort of emerging threats and border management?
I've seen that the most innovative and sort of exciting new innovations in border management and border security approaches all sort of come from the same place, and it's dealing with this challenge of scale, where you're dealing with the number of people crossing borders daily, coming from whether they're coming as in cars, pedestrians, people arriving in airports, that volume of cargo containers moving through seaports, the amount of information that needs to be processed about people, and then even things like the number of displaced people arriving, particularly in the United States in the last decade, really, on the southwest border. And a lot of the new approaches that have been developed, and not all of them in a sort of straightforward way, often in sort of halting or indirect ways, as policymakers and operators have tried to adjust, deal with that particular challenge. And so when they're successful, they apply new technological approaches, new ways to integrate, particularly to analyze data and make decisions more quickly, with operational improvements that streamline things, reduce bottlenecks, and where you get away from sort of the constant challenge in border management, where there's some place where things are backed up. People are angry, your boss is getting called in DC or something, and they're telling you to move things along, but you're still trying to adhere to whatever kinds of different processes, legal processes, security requirements, other humanitarian obligations you have, and balancing those two things. So, that has been something that I've seen policymakers in the United States and in other countries we partnered with struggle with, and where when companies went outside, technology developers, other things, other researchers have been able to come up with exciting new solutions. It's often helped with those particular pain points. How do we better process air cargo? How do we deal with these kinds of challenges where we can't just go through and physically inspect millions and millions of boxes? So that I think has been one of the key lessons.
So in that space, and I'm always interested about how we, as different agencies with different focuses, how do we co-develop the solutions to some of these problems? And you're talking about some of this is being driven by industry or consultants to say, here's the problem, how do we address that process? How active is that stage of co-development, or is it tends to be reactionary as opposed to strategic?
So it's very active. It operates with, just to be honest, different levels of success. That I think what I've seen that doesn't work is when folks in government just try and come up with all the requirements on their own, right? They think, okay, what would be an optimal sort of technological solution for this? And, because you're in government, you have to bring in everyone who has some kind of stake in it. And suddenly, you've got this 1,000-part mousetrap that you're trying to have some poor contractor design to specifications that don't make sense. The other, I guess, the other sort of significant not challenge, but something that affects the perspective of a lot of the way a lot of this is developed in the United States, particularly, is that just so many of the industry government partnerships and the operations for technology development in the United States are through the Defense Department or agencies, partners of the Defense Department. It's just a very, very sophisticated, very mature ecosystem for that kind of work. And there isn't anything, on the Homeland Security side, it's not comparable. The scale is just totally different. And so the result of that is you have a lot of really exciting new technology. You have a lot of interesting companies doing a lot of work on the defense side, and developing things that often get ported over. But that means that the kind of tools that are developed, a lot of the really innovative stuff that happens, are very focused on things where there's primarily a defense application, and then they're thinking through how it can be transferred to Homeland Security. So you'll have really sophisticated systems to detect someone or something moving between the ports of entry because they were designed for battlefield context, where it's, identifying someone who may be planning an IED or something. But then when you get to things like some analyzing trade data or things like dealing with the challenges inside cargo containers, where there aren't quite the same kind of direct analogies, or even, or I guess in particular, the issues around dealing with large numbers of displaced people, a lot of the traditional technology development processes between the U.S. government and the private sector aren't quite as good a fit, and so you have to find other ways to partner to develop things. So I think that's something that needed to work to get beyond, and I think that particularly in the United States are still working to get beyond.
So is that a growth niche? And I guess the other part of it is that in that co-development, is it also across national boundaries, that co-development of here's a problem, how do we work to collectively solve this?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think there's certainly spaces where there are solutions to problems that are being developed that are then applied, that then move to other partners who are dealing with very, very comparable challenges. The challenges around dealing humanely with large numbers of displaced people who are arriving somewhere and claiming asylum. And I understand that the approach of the United States government has changed dramatically in the current administration, but even so, these challenges of how to deal with large numbers of people arriving, to handle claims, to figure out how they move through different parts of immigration and legal processes, and a lot of the associated data management requirements, a lot of the other associated really like contracting and structural requirements that go into the kinds of even short-term shelter operations that go into this. We've seen lessons from what's happened in the United States being used with partners in Mexico and Central America, and I think and also in Europe and other places, and analogously similar solutions in other places have been recognized in the United States. I think there are sort of fundamentally there are other kinds of technological challenges, especially around cybersecurity and then related to autonomous systems, where the cutting edge may not be in the United States. Certainly with autonomous systems, the war in Ukraine has driven an enormous amount of innovation and development, and so there are places where folks on the U.S. side are just trying to are learning from international partners to try and figure out where sort of the cutting edge is and how lessons from other places can be applied.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that going back to your point earlier, like this is a constantly evolving state. It's again, the sausage making. How do we sort of look at all these different pieces? Now, in that context too, we're also seeing increasingly complex transnational concerns, cybersecurity, political instability, refugee migration, and certainly transnational criminal organizations. Does this require us to sort of reconceptualize borders to address these particular kinds of issues that we're addressing, and the speed at which we're having to respond?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really dramatic example of the way that the old conception of borders, right, where it's just like a physical line where you can sort of the Berlin Wall model, right? It's like, well, we're just going to pile resources on the line to intercept anything dangerous or that we don't want that can come up against it, has been overwhelmed by technological advances, right? I mean, obviously that doesn't work for cybersecurity threats. I mean, even something like the kind of control that the Chinese government has over access to the country does not eliminate these kind of weaknesses entirely. And then with the development of things like hobby drones that are able, that can be bought cheaply, that can be flown easily with small amounts of training, which can be used anywhere to cross a border, and where there's both extreme challenges in immediate detection, but then also some large limits around the way you can respond and what you can do in terms of counter drone measures. I think those are showing how there just isn't an obvious approach where you can intercept every possible threat that arrives at the border, where you have to have integrated cross-border processes where you're working with partners, where law enforcement and other authorities on both sides of the border are collaborating. I think it's also been shown to be very true with the movement of displaced people, particularly asylum seekers, where you just countries fundamentally have to have some kind of interaction, even when it's honestly fairly hostile. There still have to be partnerships, communication, and work among the different countries in order to do anything. And so that's been, I think, just reinforced more and more by the changes we've seen and the sort of new developments, both politically and technologically.
Yeah, it certainly would expect us to interact differently than traditional frameworks would have, certainly from a historical perspective, sort of framed as well. Again, that constant interaction, that communication, the willingness to share, but also recognizing that that wall mentality is a limited sort of response to these kinds of issues, for sure. Now, you reference technology there in terms of that aspect of constant growth and evolution. You know, from your perspective, which technological advancements or developments do you believe hold the most promise for this environment, but also which raise maybe the most significant concerns in terms of the application of it?
Yeah, I think a particularly interesting development for both of those, both for the promises and for challenges, is the expansion of autonomous systems, unmanned vehicles, the ability, both the spread of the technology and the enormous leaps forward in the capabilities that there are. So I am particularly interested in the way that autonomous vehicles can screen different things, where they can be used to do the kinds of repetitive processes that in the past you would have to have an officer do. So going and checking a bunch of different locations again and again and again, or going through and looking at things like the seal numbers on hundreds of cargo containers every day to check and make sure that they match what's in the manifest. Things that you would, if you had unlimited officer time, you would do, but don't make any sense because people would be so bored they would quit. But even aside from that, right, it just wouldn't be reasonable. But you know, a drone can do lots of those things and gather enormous amounts of information. I think we're starting to see how the information that's gathered is expanding enormously and creates a lot of exciting opportunities to fuse all of that and put it together in ways that can be operationally useful. We've certainly seen large expansions of that in terms of interdicting movements between the ports of entry, and I think we're going to see it increasingly in other contexts. The flip side of that is they present an enormous challenge. It is not hard to get a drone. It doesn't take that long to learn to fly it reasonably well. And you know, as they can carry larger and larger loads, and especially in a world where we're dealing with very, very dense contraband like fentanyl, it's enormously challenging to be able to just identify and then respond to potential threats. And I think the UAS, the uncrewed autonomous systems, are particularly challenging in this space because in border environments or in critical infrastructure environments, you're limited in what you can do to respond. You know, in a battlefield context, it's still tricky, but you can just blow the thing up, right? Or you can throw a net over it, or you can use electronic pulse weapons to scramble them. You know, you can take a bunch of steps where when you're in an urban environment on the border, it would not be safe or appropriate at all. And so you're dealing with a limited toolkit, right? So it's like there's something coming across the border. It's clearly some kind of drone. We don't know what's on it. We have to make decisions. What kind of model is it? What could it be carrying? Is it behaving, in certain ways? Like, for example, drones that aren't communicating with their controllers are much more likely to be what we call suicide drones. Something could be carrying an explosive package or something else, right? Where they're just going on a set route, where they're designed not to let anyone take over their electronic controls. And so there's a whole sort of suite of challenges around this that I think are largely unsolved. And going from just identifying what something is, figuring out why it's behaving in a certain way, evaluating how much of a threat it is, and then what you can do to respond to it. Can we communicate with the operator, tell them that this is not an appropriate place for them to take wedding pictures or whatever, all the way across to, is this something that we need to find a way to get out of the sky, and how do we do that safely? It is enormously challenging, and something that is, I think, largely not been figured out. Even in battlefield context, it's very tricky, but in border management context is something that is I think particularly vexing.
Yeah, and it really goes back to that earlier point of like reconceptualizing borders. It's just that kind of fluidness, and what is now transcending these areas really forces us to think differently about what that border is, control, access, all of those pieces that this technology is really forcing us to think differently about that, for sure. Now,
yeah, I mean, can you send the RCMP to arrest the person flying it, right? I mean, that's the best outcome. But anyway, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, right.
Yeah, no. But that's it. It's a different kind of set of communications and interactions with different agencies within that sphere of border control and oversight too. And you're right. It changes the dynamic of what we expect in that process as well. So, I mean, it's interesting then when we're talking about these sort of reconceptualization of borders and the technology, but are there regions and borders that you believe provide instructive models for innovative governance and technological approaches and the practices of how they're responding to these issues?
Sure. I think one of the areas that has been really interesting has been with air cargo, and the way that the private sector and government have combined to gather information about air cargo and parcels that are coming across borders. But they've sort of recognized that it doesn't make sense to just wait for something to arrive and then try and inspect a certain percentage of it. And where there's an industry partnership in the United States, the industry partnership was developed after the we call the Yemen cargo plot, where Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had placed bombs and printer cartridges and mailed them from Yemen to destined for synagogues in Chicago, and they were actually carried in the belly cargo of passenger planes at one point before an intelligence tip allowed them to be intercepted and removed, but where it became very obvious that the existing approach didn't work, and where instead of just sort of coming down, I think the way the U.S. government would have done after 9/11 with like, here are the new regulations, everyone has to adjust to them, and we don't really care how much pain it causes. They instead partnered with carriers in order to come up with a set of new policies, procedures, information sharing processes that that took advantage of the information that was being gathered and analyzed for logistical purposes. And so I think that's one example. I would say the other model, and this is a model that's been around for a long time, but sort of shows a different way of thinking about borders, is the way that pre-clearance is handled in Canada for U.S. bound passengers, where for a very long time we've recognized that entry into the United States is not like when the plane moves right across the physical border, but which is something that is much more of a fluid process, where there are places where it makes more sense, both from a logistical and security standpoint, to do things. And I think that the lessons and the efficiencies and things that we've seen from that, and where I know we've tried to apply them in other cargo contexts as limited success, but are something that I think really need to be thought through more and applied more broadly.
And I think this goes to a question that I want to sort of pose, like, how do we integrate these kinds of ideas, the strategic thinking, into border management while we're still kind of dealing with the operational reality of that? So again, here's the issue. We need to respond to it, but strategically, how are we starting to think about those elements? How do we think about policies and practices that can address this in really a reactive and responsive state?
So I think one of the thing, and I think that the University of Victoria has been a leader in this, but one of the things that needs to happen is folks need to recognize that border management is its own sort of interesting area of study that requires certain expertise, certain understandings, and a certain strategic approach, and that leaders who have backgrounds in other security contexts won't necessarily have the kind of policy framework that they need in order to get in and make really informed decisions about border management. And so, from my own experience, particularly in the United States, often leaders will come into the Department of Homeland Security, and part of this is because it was a new department from the way the United States was, the way the United States security enterprise was organized, but come from either defense backgrounds or prosecuted backgrounds, right there. They come from the Department of Justice, and that's where we have developed traditionally security executives. And so folks can be very sophisticated and have had, remarkable careers, but in the Pentagon. And that is sometimes very useful for for thinking about border security challenges and the kinds of partnerships that the United States needs to have to secure the flows of goods and people internationally. But sometimes it's not, and sometimes it can be quite misleading. And then I think that that building this policy infrastructure around borders, around the secure movement of international trade and the challenges around that is really important, and something that should be developed, and where I would hope in the future, as this is developed and built out, where executives would sort of be expected to have certain competencies and certain things in their background that would help them make effective decisions and understand border communities and a lot of these other sort of specific problem sets around border management.
And this kind of leads me to the question that I've been asking a number of folks, and certainly how important it is in around skills development. What skills should we be developing in the next generation for border professionals to navigate this environment and also the fluidness of what this environment is?
Yeah, I think so. There are the sort of the things that are straightforward that have been part of the border manager toolkit. A sophisticated understanding of trade, ability to work with international partners and a fairly broad cross-section of international partners, a sophisticated understanding of immigration law and what these and the way that governments interact with the movement of people. But increasingly, it also is requiring an understanding of what is involved in dealing with large volumes of displaced people seeking humanitarian protections, right? What does that look like? Like what is an effective what is an appropriate contractor to handle something like a bunch of families who are seeking humanitarian protections to create a shelter for them, and where they're moving on into some other setting? How is that done safely? How is that done appropriately? How is data collected, but then done so in secure and appropriate ways? All of those kinds of questions are urgent for border managers in a way that they may not have been before, and where people who make where leaders often, folks in government find themselves making what seem like this simple decision where it's like, well, this is a large contractor or something we used for other things, where in fact they're not an appropriate choice, right? And so I think there are a lot of these kind of emerging questions, and a lot of them will center around where government and the private sector, and particularly some of their contractors, interact, and where they can make, appropriate and informed decisions about how things should really be managed. So I think that's a big one. And then the last one is technology development. I referenced this a little bit before, but especially in the border security, in the broader border management space, there have not been great pathways for new companies, for innovative researchers to be able to partner and get things in front of operators and government policymakers in the way that there are in other places, where there in the United States particularly, there are in the world of healthcare and the world of defense. They're very, very robust processes, great partnerships between universities. I mean, have been historically great partnerships between universities and government and other pathways. And so in the broader homeland security enterprise, that's still nascent, and it's just not as developed, or it's very difficult for folks to navigate who don't have extensive backgrounds in government.
Yeah, and it kind of goes back to this concept of reconceptualizing borders. So too, do we need to reconceptualize the skills and the competencies that are required for this complex operational and strategic orientation that we have to take towards borders. So yeah, it's an interesting piece that we need to look at skills development as not a one and done, it's an evolution of new ideas and applications, and our training models and our educational models and even our research needs to adapt and kind of tease those along. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. So listen, Ben, we have come to the end of our time, and I know we could have gone on for many more hours just having this conversation. It's always it's a bit of a teaser for sure, but I really want to thank you for joining us and being part of this conversation, and certainly, being kind and sharing your analysis and expertise, which becomes really important for us to sort of, again, nudge the ideas, the skills, the reconceptualization of what border management is. So again, thank you so much. And I also want to thank the Borders and Governance Lab for sponsoring this webinar and their commitment to engaging and providing a platform for this kind of discussion. And if our viewers have any more information they'd like to seek, go to www.bigglobalization.org. And also, just to remind you that to sign up for our next webinar on May 28th with Peter Swartz, the co-founder and chief science officer from Altana, who will join us on the 28th. Again, thank you, Ben. Truly appreciate this, and look forward to chatting you sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Curtis. This was such a pleasure.
Take care.
All right, goodbye.
Bye-bye.